Hello, I'm Mike Pothier, Program Manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, and I'm talking to Lawson Naidoo, who is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. We're going to be talking about some of the constitutional aspects of the present lockdown. Lawson, it seems that as far as some ministers are concerned, we are in a period of rule by decree, almost like martial law. But in fact, the Disaster Management Act doesn't allow for that, does it? There is still an important role for Parliament.
Well, there's an important role for the Constitution, first and foremost, Mike, in that the Constitution has not been suspended, nor has the rule of law. Whilst the Disaster Management Act does give the executive quite broad powers, these have to be implemented in a rational manner within the context of the Constitution itself. So, whilst we may be seeing some extent of executive diktat in terms of the promulgation of regulations under the Disaster Management Act, and the fact that the Act itself does not make any specific reference to oversight by Parliament, it does appear that the executive is able to get away with rather a lot at the moment.
Yeah. Right at the beginning, when it was announced that the SANDF was to be deployed, the Minister of Defence said something which a lot of us found quite concerning. I'm going to quote from one of her statements. She said, "It'll only be skop, skit and donner when circumstances determine that. For now, we're a constitutional democracy. We do understand our obligations in terms of the Constitution. Our soldiers understand the circumstances under which they are being deployed." Now, there's quite a lot in those few sentences to worry us. But what do you think, in the first place, she meant by "for now, we're a constitutional democracy"?
Well, I think what that quote demonstrates, Mike, is that the minister does not understand the constitutional responsibilities that are placed on members of the South African National Defence Force and herself as the Minister of Defence and Military Veterans. The deployment of the army in terms of the Constitution to support police work is the ambit of the deployment of the National Defence Force in these circumstances. They are there to assist the police, and the Constitution under no circumstances would entertain the notion of skop, skit and donner of ordinary civilians, regardless of the circumstances. So for the minister to even entertain that thought is extremely troubling.
Yeah, and she's not the only one at very senior levels of government who seems to have that lack of understanding. It brings into question whether there's any kind of constitutional formation in those circles. You get to be a senior minister and you don't really understand some of the basic issues of constitutional law.
Well, I think, as you point out, we've seen this on numerous occasions from numerous people in the executive, as well as people within Parliament itself, who clearly do not understand the Constitution and the responsibilities it places upon them as elected representatives. They all take an oath of office when they're sworn in as either as members of Parliament and again when they're sworn in as members of the executive. But they appear to be paying lip service to that, not really understanding the responsibilities that are placed on them to act squarely within the ambit of the Constitution and the law, and nothing else.
We've certainly seen some examples of skop, skit and donner. We have at least one, perhaps two cases where it appears that civilians were killed, but it appears very strongly that it was murder at the hands of the Defence Force. But are we perhaps focusing unduly on a few isolated incidents? It will be argued, of course, that there are thousands, tens of thousands of police officers and soldiers deployed, and only a tiny handful, the argument goes, are indulging in this. Or should we be really worried about it?
No, I think we ought to be very concerned. One death or even one instance of an abuse of authority by a member of the police service or the Defence Force would be a cause for great concern. They are there to, deployed in terms of the Disaster Management Act to protect South African citizens and people in South Africa in the course of this pandemic that is sweeping through our country, and not to add to the problems that we are currently facing. So I don't think it's an overreaction, and I think this is something that we've seen from the police service in particular. And one goes back to the Marikana massacre, where the police acted quite clearly unlawfully, illegally in mowing down dozens of people. We go back to the murder of Andres Tatane in Vicksburg in 2011, and it would appear that the police have not learned their lessons from those previous episodes in our history, that they are not properly prepared for public order policing, and they do not understand their responsibilities within the constitutional order.
Yeah, it also seems that there's been a long tendency for one administration after the other to appoint police ministers who, in my view anyway, set the wrong tone, give the wrong example, and we certainly seem to be sitting with that now.
Indeed, we are. We have, a very boisterous Minister of Police at the moment, who appears to be, if not encouraging such behavior by police officers, certainly they seem to be condoning the excesses of it. And I think one of the unfortunate things in this is that there's been no condemnation from the Minister of Police, the Minister of Defense, and not even the President himself, to say that these actions are unacceptable and that appropriate action will be taken. I mean, in the Kabane case, which judgment came out today, it's shocking that the soldiers that have allegedly been involved in his murder had not been suspended until such time as today's judgment has come out, when the judge has ordered that they should be suspended. Now, that's just unacceptable in a democracy.
Yeah. While we're talking about ministers, it strikes me as a little bit strange that almost every time that there's been a news conference or ministers have been called upon to explain some of the harsher aspects of lockdown, the behavior of the police, the powers of the police, etc., etc. It's been the Minister of Police and not the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development who has been the front man, if I can call it that. I would have thought that there was a proper role there for the Justice Minister.
Indeed, there ought to be, and I do know that the Minister of Justice has appeared before a parliamentary committee and has been questioned on some of these issues. But I think you rightly point out that it's the Minister of Police that appears to be taking the lead in this matter, whereas it perhaps ought to have been the Minister of Justice, and it ought to be, and I think what's been lacking is clear direction from the President himself. I think the President, from the moment that there were first allegations of abuse of authority by the police and the Defence Force, the President ought to have stepped in at that point and, pardon the pun, but read the Riot Act to the police and the Defence Force.
Ministers from the past, we now have Trevor Manuel coming out very publicly, very strongly over the last week or so, in print and on the Daily Maverick and so on. Quite angry, I think, about this state of affairs and saying that we shouldn't tolerate it. We didn't tolerate it back in the days of apartheid. We resisted it, and he's calling on people to resist it again now. But that's easier said than done. What does an ordinary citizen actually do when they've got a soldier or a police officer screaming instructions at them and threatening to arrest them for some petty infraction of the rules?
Well, given the fact that we're living under a lockdown at the moment, there's probably very little that can be done immediately in those circumstances. One is confronted by a police officer or a member of the Defence Force. One doesn't have an immediate recourse to anything, but it does not mean that South Africans should tolerate that kind of abuse of authority. And we need to use the channels that are available to us, whether it be complaints to the Independent Police Investigating Directorate, of which there have been numerous, complaints with the Military Ombudsman, again, of which there have been many. But we've seen in both those instances that progress in investigating these alleged breaches has been very slow. Parliament itself, which has been presented with some evidence of these misdemeanors, has basically turned a blind eye to it and come out and effectively condone that behavior by saying that they support the actions of the police and the defense force. So at the moment, South Africans are perhaps seeing that there's very little opportunity for them to air their grievances effectively and for action to be taken. But that should not deter us, because we need to ensure that any abuse of authority during the period of this lockdown needs to be accounted for, whether it's now or in the future.
Yeah. And of course, it also reinforces once again the question of IPID's real independence, of being ultimately responsible, not ultimately, but partly responsible to the Minister of Police and being located within that ministry.
Well, there's of course the long-standing institutional autonomy of IPID, but again, as was pointed out, I think in the proceedings in the Parliamentary Committee yesterday, where the Parliamentary Committee appeared to agree that IPID needed to be given additional resources to be able to exercise its functions more effectively. So I think there's a recognition that the institutions, independent institutions such as IPID, need to be properly resourced to be able to do their jobs.
Just to move away from the excesses of security forces and so on, in a general sense, many people are saying that at the beginning of the lockdown, the government won a high degree of trust and confidence from the populace as a whole. There was good communication, President demonstrated leadership and so on. But as the weeks have gone past, we've become more and more frustrated by a whole lot of petty rules and regulations, and some that seem irrational, not to make much sense at all. And this trust is not being entirely squandered. It is certainly being frittered away a little bit. Now, if that's the case, it has quite serious consequences, doesn't it?
Indeed, it does. And I think the very important word in all of that, Mike, is trust. In a situation like this, where government, as we've said earlier, has very broad powers under the Disaster Management Act, there's got to be a level of public confidence and trust in the executive to use that authority in a responsible way that is aimed at tackling the spread of the virus, which is what we were told that the measures under the DMA were being instituted for. But with these, a whole series of what appear to be very arbitrary and irrational measures that are being implemented, that trust is being frittered away. People are getting increasingly frustrated and losing faith in government's ability to contain the pandemic, and people are beginning to question the motives behind some of the decisions that government is taking, because they do not appear to be directly related to fighting the pandemic.
And sooner or later, of course, people will begin to, well, they're already breaking the rules and rebelling against all the regulations. Another striking factor was that at the beginning of the whole process, there was a very high degree of political unanimity and buy-in from the opposition parties. That also has begun to fray a little bit, and we now know that both the DA and the Freedom Front Plus are in the process of pursuing court proceedings. The Freedom Front Plus seems to be fairly clear that it wishes to have the lockdown more or less lifted. The DA is after a few other remedies. What do you think in general terms of the wisdom of political parties rushing off to court at this stage? I assume that the government would want to say, look, we're in the middle of crisis management. Please just, let us get on with it.
Well, 2 points. I think the first point before we get to the court cases is, in the early days, as you point out, Mike, there was consultation by the president with the leaders of all of the opposition parties represented in Parliament. This was, as we will recall, at the time when Parliament was in recess and was not meeting. And I think that was the right and responsible thing for the president to do, to consult with the leaders of all of the opposition parties, explain government's position to them. And I think that bore fruit at the time, because he got full backing from all of the opposition parties for the imposition of the declaration of state of national disaster, the initial measures under the lockdown, and so on, received unanimous support. That kind of consultation seems in recent weeks to have fallen by the wayside, and I think this is where we're beginning to see the political divisions that are emerging. It's almost inevitable that some of these matters will end up in court, because I think partly, although Parliament has now reconvened, committees are meeting, they're not really directly seeking to interrogate the provisions that have been put in place under the Disaster Management Act. They're not interrogating that sufficiently. So parties and others are being left with having to seek recourse in the courts. Now, this poses a difficult dilemma for the courts, and we've seen this over the last decade with the number of challenges under the during the time of the Zuma administration, when many opposition parties and civil society organizations had to resort to the courts to try and ensure that the rule of law was being followed. But this is a difficult situation. I think everyone recognizes, as much as we might disagree or criticize certain actions that the government has taken, that it's an incredibly difficult situation to manage. And I'm not sure the courts are going to be eager to go in and say, well, the lockdown must be lifted. Do they have the requisite information at their disposal to be able to take such a decision? I would think it's highly unlikely. I think we may well see that the courts are deferred to the executive on these issues, except in instances where there's a clear lack of rationality in some aspects of the decision that has been taken. And I think it's interesting that in the application that has been brought by the Democratic Alliance, for example, they're not challenging the constitutionality of the regulations as a whole under the Disaster Management Act, but they've isolated a few instances such as the curfew, the hours of public transport, the restricted hours of exercise time, and so on, and trying to say that those are irrational in that they are not directly linked to the containing the spread of the pandemic. They may find more fertile ground in those issues and getting a court to say that those particular issues are irrational. But I think it would be difficult for a court to say that the lockdown itself is irrational, because I don't think they will have the necessary information at their disposal to reach such a decision.
And of course, if they do win, that happens to be the DA, if they do win on having one or two of the more questionable regulations reviewed and set aside, then it also makes it more likely, I suppose, that those who draft the regulations from now on will think a little bit more carefully about what they put into them.
Well, one would certainly hope so, Mike. And I think one of the problems that we've seen with some of the regulations that have been drafted, they've clearly not been drafted properly. They lack the kind of clarity that we expect in law. And I think the overriding goal of government ought to be to make it as simple as possible for people to abide by the regulations, and not to make it difficult. And I think what they've done with a series of highly complex regulations that have been put in place is to make it very complicated, because people don't know what's really allowed and what's not allowed, and therefore trying to find loopholes in the system. But it ought to be simple and clear so everybody can follow them and everybody can abide by them. Because I think that that goodwill is there, is wanting to cooperate with government, but government has a responsibility to make it easy for us to do so.
Right. We'll leave it there. Lawson, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike.